Scrupulous developers will reuse assets and concepts between games in order to build on previous success and avoid having to build a new project from scratch every time. Some things don't have to be changed, and players often won't notice an asset that has been reused, or they will associate a repeated concept as being integral to the series or genre. Knowing which ideas can and cannot be reused between projects is one of the greatest skills an indie developer can learn, and Oleander Garden's Hexcraft Harlequin Fair is a shining example of reusing ideas correctly. Garden's games have all been built upon their previous incarnation, increasing the scope of mechanical function as well as breadth of content. Pagan Autogeny featured the same first-person movement and combat mechanics that Eventide Sigil and Harlequin Fair contain, as well as a rampant disregard for linear structure that would carry forward. Eventide Sigil would introduce more players into the scavenger hunt, requiring the player to determine who had been where at what time, and then chasing that person down. Harlequin Fair takes all of these systems, and adds a few new ones to build even further. My issues with Garden's games prior to Harlequin Fair was the quantity of content within. Autogeny took fewer than 2 hours to finish, and I spent less than an hour more with Eventide Sigil. Total gameplay time is not at all reflective of gameplay quality, but these short lengths left me dissatisfied, wishing for more because what I had played was so unique. Has Garden remedied these complaints within Harlequin Fair? And, if the game is more substantial, has the additional substance been detrimental to the game's overall quality? The footage for this video was recorded on stream. You can be notified of when streams go live, as well as chat and suggest games on the Discord in the description. Much like Pagan Autogeny and Eventide Sigil before it, Hexcraft Harlequin Fair tasks the player with searching the world for a number of items to trigger further changes in that world. This time, however, the quest isn't to form a singular collection in order to trigger an ending. Most objects that must be collected require previous collections to be completed before they can be obtained. For example, in order to acquire the rheostat Hermetic, the player must offer 4 aces to an altar. Those aces are the equivalent of Eventide Sigil's relics, and must be collected via conversing, sleuthing, and combating the other characters in the game. The rheostat is also a key to another event further along, so while the Eventide Sigil format has been co-opted for this game, it only functions as a single link within the treasure hunting chain. Each stage tasks the player with tackling a different set of obstacles, so the player needs to determine what they are, and then the best way to overcome them. Some tasks require the player to prepare for grueling battles against an army of enemies, while others act as a series of boss encounters, or require the player to investigate every corner of every area, and maybe even figure out a puzzle. There are weapons and armor to gather in order to increase the likelihood of surviving those enemy encounters. There's a magic system, although I never encountered useful offensive magic. And there's an alchemy system to brew buffing potions composed of a single liquid and a single herb. The world is filled with dungeons that contain some form of key to reach the next tier of locations and items. In order to dive into the deepest corners of Toronto, the player is given a handful of tools to use. Vivian has a different stat sheet within the real world, and most of these stats are influenceable via a few equipment slots as well as the potions the player can brew. Faith, armor, strength, pierce, and speed are the equipment stats, while wealth, hungry, and grace can be altered via other methods. Faith is a required stat in order to deal damage to enemies. Without faith, Vivian will not deal damage, and the player should really reconsider their equipment loadout. Faith may have other functions, but I wasn't able to determine any. Armor reduces incoming damage. By how much I'm unsure, since there is no numbered health bar visible. Strength increases outgoing damage. With the lack of melee weapons in this game, I think this stat is handled more naturally this way. Both Ashley and I made this misconception that strength in Autogeny would only increase damage from the sword, but it also powers up the guns. Pierce reduces the enemy armor value on hit. Pretty handy when dealing with the Crusaders, but not so much when fighting werewolves and vampires. Speed is obvious, as is wealth. If Vivian is hungry, then their health regeneration will be deactivated. The player must exchange wealth for food, and bring food with them to locations they anticipate engaging in combat. And grace can be gained by casting the benediction, although I'm unsure of the function. While these stats are interesting to play with, stacking Pierce to kill Crusaders easily, and then switching over to speed when the enemy doesn't have a ranged weapon to run around them indefinitely, the player has very little storage capability. And since the game primarily revolves around collecting items, that storage capacity will be reached quickly. So what I ended up doing was finding a couple of items I liked and never taking them off. There is another group of stat-changing collectibles that I had presumed would be something more than that. But unfortunately, the persona discs the player can find are simply another equipment slot that can only be accessed from Vivian's home. These discs are valuable though, so fighting through a catacomb that ends with a podium and a persona disc isn't too bad. There's no way to know whether the fighting is for an upgrade or an objective anyway, so I can't imagine many feeling dissatisfied by this result. Initially, the player is dumped into the city without guidance. The player will need to discern their goals as they explore, and learn how to achieve them in the same way. Toronto is first split into 5 locations, but eventually the player will be able to explore 2 more once they are revealed on the map. Vivian's home, Chinatown, the Path System, St. Clair, and the Ravine are the first handful of locations, and the rail yard and the midway are discovered later on. I was drawn to explore the Path System first, and discovered that it was a mall with a dark underground section. Without weapons or a light source, I chose to try another location. Chinatown contains a triad base, some housing and more shops, and a tunnel occupied by the undead. Luring a zombie into the street caused the NPCs to begin fighting, and triad members were getting involved too. In the end, a bunch of NPCs had died, and I was able to scoop up their equipment, cash, and any cards they may have had. I took these items to the Ravine next, where the altar that dispenses the first major collectible is located. My mission was now to collect the 4 aces and bring them to this location. I basically went on a murderous rampage, since I was unsure if the aces would have spawning locations somewhere in the world. In this rampage, I took down the Triad House, as well as the White Knights in St. Clair, rewarding me with more objects towards completing the various rituals and keys to continue deeper into the darkness. The more I completed, the closer I came to meeting Ada. Narrative might be a strong word in this case, but Harlequin Fair has some things that could be considered plot points. Vivian's computer is on in their house, and the player can read the last email Vivian received to learn of a general set of goals within the game, as well as a hint for getting the good ending. Meanwhile, there appears to be a growing conflict between the forces of heaven and hell occurring in Toronto. There are a few hideouts filled with necromancers and vampires, and even a demonic presence in some of the deeper dungeons. A church hosts a group of holy warriors, and there are a couple of instances where the player must battle an angel. More and more powerful creatures are summoned onto the mortal plane, and somehow Vivian is the only one capable of destroying them. Ada seems to be an angel too, and awaits within the slaughter field, a separate dimension that could only be accessed if the player possesses the Abaddon Waystone and the ancient astrolabe. Most changes in the world come as a result of the player's actions, but the forces of evil will eventually take over the path system and resist the player's ventures into the underground. Violence will occur, NPCs will die, and the player will be instrumental in the fate of the afterlife. Utility. Hexcraft Harlequin Fair's presentation has even been cultivated from Eventide Sigils, with many of the sounds and UI pieces being translated into Harlequin Fair's new world. That world is much darker and significantly less blocky this time, with an expertly implemented lighting system, and the removal of those culling filters to make the environments moody and contiguous. I really enjoy this new grimy nocturnal look. It plays to the strengths of the game's art style and makes all of the violence and monsters fit into the world. NPCs are again the 2D sprites, although distinguishing between characters is far easier now that they aren't all knights with different shields. Some of the sprites are weaker than others, but overall the quality is appropriate. The imps are fun, and I like the zombies a lot. The item sprites are very familiar, another example of recycling excellent pieces. It's still great to see that this whole project can exist with minimal animation, to keep the development focus on the necessities, and to give more space for any ideas Garden may have wanted to include. Autogeny's themes are very upfront with the player, while I wasn't fully sure if Eventide Sigil had any overarching themes, and Harlequin Fair hasn't hidden too much beyond the Christian elements, which aren't exactly subtle. I feel that it's natural for a player to read into the content of Garden's games, to try and discern something deeper, because Autogeny was so blatant. But this time around, I would liken that exercise to some first-year university student trying to explain how Dr. Frankenstein was secretly gay, and the color of his furniture was somehow evidence to that statement. That being said, the persona discs are pretty conspicuous, right? Trying out new character traits by loading them into one's home computer and seeing how they fit? Is Vivian building new character traits by stumbling upon them in the wild or by tearing them from their previous owner? I can think of less destructive ways to find oneself. Satisfaction is a strange emotion to feel when playing games. At least for me it is. Most puzzles in games are pathetic unless the game is built around them. So Harlequin Fair's resistance to the player's progression is deeply refreshing. The player needs to figure out their goal and figure out a way to complete that task. And to not be told what and how shows Garden's trust in the player's capability. It is the definitive Oleander Garden experience thus far, and if anyone were to be interested in engaging with their work, I think this is the best candidate, even with the repurposed assets and ideas. If you haven't played Harlequin Fair yet, I urge you to. My perspective is much narrower than I had anticipated, and your reading will undoubtedly be different to mine. The game is definitively longer, and the expanded content is just as good, if not better, than Pagan Autogeny and Eventide Sigil, although it doesn't cover all of the same bases. What the player experiences is a complex web of scavenger hunts that all coalesce into a final battle in a higher plane of existence. Harlequin Fair isn't as emotionally distressing as Autogeny, nor is it as unsettling as Eventide Sigil. Instead, it seeks to implant a curiosity within the player. Every stone could be hiding something fascinating. Every person might have some great wisdom to share, and every doorway leads to new obstacles. Next time, the redemption of a legend will come.